Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, published posthumously in 1953, stands as one of the most influential philosophical works of the 20th century, marking a decisive shift in the study of language, thought, and meaning. This work moves decisively away from the formal logical structures that characterized his earlier Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, signaling a transition toward what became known as the philosophy of ordinary language. Wittgenstein's approach is deeply informed by the analytic tradition, notably shaped by figures like Bertrand Russell and G. Moore, under whom he initially pursued formal logic. Yet, Philosophical Investigations simultaneously critiques and diverges from the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, whose emphasis on verification and formal systems he ultimately rejected. Wittgenstein's work also challenges Cartesian dualism by exploring the ways language bridges internal mental states and external behavior. Furthermore, his alignment with pragmatist thinkers such as John Dewey underscores his focus on language as a dynamic practice embedded in context and use, rather than as a mere vehicle for representing abstract ideas or fixed truths. Meaning is use, the centrality of context. At the heart of Wittgenstein's philosophy is the revolutionary insight that the meaning of a word is not a matter of simple correspondence to objects or mental ideas, but is fundamentally determined by its use within particular contexts. Wittgenstein famously states that for many cases in which we speak of meaning, it can be defined as the use of a word in language. This shift from viewing meaning as a fixed referent to viewing it as context-dependent practical use reorients the philosophy of language away from abstract theorizing toward the concrete reality of everyday linguistic practices. For instance, consider the term game, which encompasses an array of diverse activities, chess, football, or tag, none of which can be captured by a single definition, but all share overlapping uses within different contexts. This perspective has had lasting impact, influencing fields as varied as linguistics, artificial intelligence, and philosophy, by encouraging a focus on how language functions in actual communicative practices rather than on fixed semantic boundaries. Language games and the diversity of linguistic practices. Wittgenstein's notion of language games builds directly upon his idea of meaning as use, emphasizing that language is not a monolithic entity but a collection of various forms of life, each governed by its own rules and conventions. He argues that speaking a language is a form of activity embedded within particular social practices, and that every linguistic utterance is part of a specific game with its own purposes and constraints. The word run, for example, takes on distinct meanings depending on whether it is used in the context of athletics, computing, or business. By illustrating how language operates within these multiple, overlapping games, Wittgenstein reveals how misunderstandings frequently arise when interlocutors engage in different language games without recognizing their differing rules. This insight encourages a more nuanced appreciation of communication, particularly in multicultural or interdisciplinary contexts, where the diversity of language uses can otherwise hinder mutual understanding. Family resemblances, rejecting essentialism. Wittgenstein further dismantles traditional philosophical quests for rigid, essential definitions by introducing the concept of family resemblances. Instead of assuming that every concept must possess a single defining feature, he proposes that many ideas are connected by a network of overlapping similarities that crisscross in complex ways. This means that categories like art or game do not hinge on a single essence but on a web of shared traits, some more prominent and others more peripheral. The concept of art, for example, embraces painting, sculpture, music, and performance, each sharing overlapping qualities without a universal defining characteristic. This flexible approach to classification encourages adaptability in disciplines such as law, science, and aesthetics, where rigid categorical definitions often prove inadequate or exclusionary. The private language argument and public criteria for meaning. One of Wittgenstein's most influential contributions is his critique of the notion of a private language, language that refers exclusively to inner sensations or mental states inaccessible to others. He argues that language is inherently a public, social phenomenon, dependent on shared criteria, and observable practices. As Wittgenstein succinctly puts it, an inner process requires outward criteria for meaningfulness. This means that a private language, purportedly understandable by only a single individual, is incoherent because the meaning of words like pain depends on publicly recognizable behaviors such as wincing or crying. This argument challenges the Cartesian assumption of a private mental realm fundamentally separate from shared linguistic practices, and it has had a profound impact on contemporary debates in philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and the study of consciousness, emphasizing the social and intersubjective nature of language and experience. Philosophy as therapy, resolving conceptual confusions. Wittgenstein famously reconceptualizes philosophy itself not as a quest for ultimate metaphysical truths but as a therapeutic practice aimed at resolving the conceptual confusions that arise from misunderstandings of language. Just as a doctor treats an illness, the philosopher's task is to untangle philosophical problems by clarifying how language is actually used. For example, the perennial question "what is the meaning of life?" may lose its apparent mystery once we examine the different contexts in which meaning is employed. By dissolving confusions rather than constructing grand theories, Wittgenstein's therapeutic approach promotes careful attention to ordinary language, encouraging clearer thinking and more precise communication. This perspective has inspired not only philosophical methodology but also approaches in education, counseling, and critical thinking. Rule following and the social nature of meaning. Closely connected to Wittgenstein's other insights is his examination of how we follow rules, which he argues cannot be understood simply as the internal grasp of a fixed rule but rather as a practice embedded in community agreement. Understanding and applying a rule is akin to obeying an order or interpreting a musical score, it depends on shared standards and communal reinforcement. For instance, the mathematical rule add 2 is meaningful not because it contains an intrinsic property, but because there is collective consensus on how to apply it. This understanding has broad implications for legal theory, education, and ethics, fields in which the interpretation of rules and norms is often contested and subject to negotiation. Wittgenstein's insight highlights the fundamentally social character of language, understanding, and normative practice. Practical relevance for communication, education, and beyond. Wittgenstein's emphasis on use and context offers powerful tools for addressing everyday challenges in communication, education, technology, and mental health. By focusing on how words function in practice, his philosophy helps to resolve misunderstandings that arise in interpersonal and cross-cultural communication, promoting empathy and clearer dialogue. In education, his critique of essentialist thinking encourages pedagogical flexibility, adapting teaching methods to diverse learners and contexts. His concepts of language games and rule following inform advancements in natural language processing and artificial intelligence, where recognizing the diversity of linguistic practices is crucial. Moreover, by rejecting the notion of private language, Wittgenstein's ideas align with therapeutic approaches in mental health that prioritize shared understanding and communication over solitary introspection. Critiques and diverse perspectives. Despite its widespread influence, philosophical investigations has faced various critiques from multiple philosophical perspectives. Logical positivists such as A.J. Ayer criticized Wittgenstein's focus on ordinary language for undermining the rigor of philosophical analysis, insisting instead on formal logic as the path to clarity. Post-structuralists, exemplified by Jacques Derrida, challenge Wittgenstein's reliance on shared linguistic rules by emphasizing the inherent instability and endless deferral of meaning. Feminist philosophers, including Nancy Fraser, critique Wittgenstein for overlooking the role of power and exclusion within language games, pointing to how dominant linguistic practices marginalize certain voices. Pragmatists like Richard Rorty align with Wittgenstein's contextualism but argue that philosophy should not only dissolve problems but also offer imaginative, constructive solutions. Additionally, Noam Chomsky's theory of universal grammar contrasts sharply with Wittgenstein's contextual and practice-based approach, positing innate linguistic structures rather than learned social practices as the basis of language. These critiques highlight both the richness and contested nature of Wittgenstein's legacy. Conclusion: Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations represents a profound reorientation in philosophical thought, foregrounding the practical, contextual, and social dimensions of language. By challenging traditional views of meaning, private language, and the purpose of philosophy itself, Wittgenstein equips us with conceptual tools to clarify confusions and enhance communication. Although subject to diverse criticisms, his work remains foundational across multiple disciplines, from linguistics and cognitive science to law and artificial intelligence. Ultimately, Wittgenstein's philosophy invites ongoing reflection on the ways language shapes our understanding of the world and ourselves, affirming the centrality of use, context, and community in human meaning. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe to keep updated on our upcoming content.